The opinions expressed by the host and guests on Where Did the Road Go are their own and do not represent those of WVBR or its management. Our aim is to explore the fringe, lost civilizations, alternative science, the paranormal, and much more. Join us on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com, where you can send us questions for our live or future guests via email or the live chat room. And remember to subscribe to us on iTunes. And now welcome to this week's edition of Where Did the Road Go?
Yes, welcome to Where Did the Road Go? And as I said in that intro, if you have any questions for any of the guests we have, go to www.wheredidtheroadgo.com while we're on the air, and I will pass them along as best I can. As well, you can check out our show archive, blog, video section, book reviews, all kinds of other stuff, some great links. And yeah, there's a lot of stuff there. You can also subscribe to us on iTunes. You can check out the YouTube page if that's what you prefer. You can subscribe to the RSS feed. There's just so much stuff there. All right. Our guest tonight is Dr. Rita Louise, and she is the author of a book entitled Man-Made, The Chronicles of Our Extraterrestrial Gods. And she is also a host of her own radio show and author of a few other books. And we're going to be talking about all that tonight. Rita, are you with us?
I am. Thanks for having me on the show tonight.
Yeah, well, thanks for being on the show. And so how did you get into all this stuff?
Well, I blame my parents for it all. When we were young, interestingly, unlike most families where you would get an allowance for doing chores or whatever, we would get an allowance because we read a book.
Oh, that's kind of cool.
And so we had to read a book, basically every 2 weeks. And I wasn't interested in, like Nancy Drew, or I don't even know what like teen books were out there because I really didn't read any of them except for Nancy Drew every so often because, they were kind of mystery books, which I like mysteries in general. And so by the time I was in like 6th or 7th grade, I had pretty much worked my way through the entire, archaeology and anthropology department at the library. And then around the same time, when I was kind of running out of books to read, I got really interested in the whole concept of ESP. There were a number of TV shows on at that time that were about ESP, and I thought it would be so cool to be able to like have these psychic moments. And so I started reading books about ESP, not that there were very many because they were right next to the witchcraft section in the library. So that wasn't really cool. And but things start, as I got a little bit older, at that point in time, there were a number of books coming out about Eastern philosophy, like Ram Dass's work was starting to become popular, and Meher Baba. And so there were other things that I could read that were spiritually opening. A friend of mine had a deck of tarot cards, and we would like do our cards. And because I figured, if I could memorize what it said in the book, I could surely be psychic. And, but my love for antiquities and anything old, so even in my study of psychic abilities and intuition, there has always been this piece that has looked at, I want to say the science behind it, the esoteric knowledge that supports the chakras and supports energy movement. And I've studied Kabbalah, and I've studied a lot of esoteric traditions. And so moving over and kind of re-engaging the concept of mythology and archaeology was actually very exciting for me because I felt like I kind of came full circle to my original love in life. And I'll tell you, the only reason I walked away from that at all was in 8th grade, we had to do a paper on what we wanted to do when we grew up. And I turned in a paper on archaeology. Now, you have to understand, this was in a Catholic school, so the theory of evolution, not such a big topic. And but one of the things we had to do was find out the educational requirements. And I wrote to this college, and they sent me back a very nice letter that basically said, if you don't have a PhD, you're really not going to go anywhere. And that turned me off to the whole thing. Mm-hmm. But even though now I have a PhD.
I was going to say, you have a PhD, don't you?
But when you're in 8th grade, the thought of God, a PhD. Yeah.
And what
So-
do you have a PhD in?
I have a PhD in natural health counseling, where the focus of my PhD was how our thoughts and emotions affect our health. So the technical word would be psychoneuroimmunology.
Interesting. I didn't know you could even go to school for that at this point.
It was kind of a piece together. I had to do a lot of begging and talking to a lot of professors to let me do kind of a special collection. I had to get advisors from the psychology department and, a lot of begging.
So are you looking at things like how placebo effect works or how the mind affects the body and what way that works?
Very much so. Like Candace Pert wrote a book called The Molecules of Emotions. And, one of the things that I investigated was how our emotional space impacts us on a physiological level. I mean, the work that I had been doing as I was working on my ND, which was a naturopath, and then PhD, is I had been working as a medical intuitive. And so from a energetic perspective, I could see how I could see, and tune into what thoughts and emotions were were creating the illness in the individual. And so this kind of gave me more the scientific part to what was going on. I mean, because it's a branch of medicine that, I don't want to say it's new because it's been around for a while. I want to say, and I'm just kind of throwing a number out there, like 40 or 50 years, more in the science area. But it's just fascinating.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Are you a fan of Jane Roberts' work with Seth?
I'm not big on channeled material.
Neither am I, honestly, at all. And Seth was the only one that I look at as an exception, and it's because most of his stuff was scientifically validatable. And it's a lot of what you're talking about right now, the way that the mind affects the body and stuff like that. So
I don't know. Maybe I'll have to look into it. I mean, the only person that has put out channeled material that I trust or honor at least is Barbara Hanclow, because
I know the name, but I don't think I've ever read anything.
She's great, and she's has a scientific mind, and she's just a very grounded person, but most of her work is not channeled. You know what I mean?
Okay.
So,
yeah, the Seth material was totally challenged, and I looked at it at thinking it was just going to be another one of these vague, sort of ridiculous, channeled things. And I picked up the Seth Speaks book and was completely blown away at the detail and the stuff that you could actually sit down and verify. And the stuff that hasn't been verified till recently that they were talking about in 1970. So it kind of stood out to me, and I still have, doubts about channeled material, but that I have a hard time debunking any of the Seth stuff, honestly.
I mean, I think that people can bring through good information on a channeled level. I don't want to knock channeling in the big picture of things, but it really depends on how clear of a channel you can be.
Well, sure.
And so if you can move your junk to the side, I mean, I think like Edgar Casey, even though he was more of like a trance medium kind of person, remote viewer, but he was a very clear channel. And if you can be a very clear channel, then I think you can tap into that cosmic consciousness or connect with, and I'm going to say an entity or some spiritual being that will communicate with you and provide you with information. I do believe that, but most people have their own thoughts and opinions and spins and will put them on things.
Right. And Jane Roberts always said she didn't know if she was actually connecting to an actual entity, if it was just a deeper part of herself, or she was very down to earth about it and was always skeptical about it. And that, I think, also impressed me about it.
Cool.
So might be something worth checking out. I mean, it like I said, it does reflect some of what you were talking about with the dealing with the mind affecting the body. And how much of effect do you think the mind has on the body?
A lot. A huge amount. It is believed that at least 85 to 90% of all illness, okay, we're not talking about accidents,
right,
but all illness is, there's a psychospiritual component to it. There's an emotional component to it. So if you get a virus, you get a virus. I mean, there are things that are environmental, which don't fall in that category. There are things, if you break your arm, you break your arm. Now, there are people that will put a spiritual component to it and say, well, there was something going on in your life and this is a message to you, but, you broke your arm. But if you have diabetes or gallbladder disease or a sore back, I mean, sore back could go either way. You could have just hurt yourself, but there are a lot of people that there is a psychological component that goes to it that, it's not like they're crazy, but it's a belief that they're holding on to or a skill set that they don't have. There's something going on inside of them that is looking to get their attention, and they're not paying attention to those promptings. And so it just builds and builds and builds from a thought to a feeling into the physical body. I mean, we could do a 5-hour show on this topic.
All right. Well, let's. You also do a radio show called Just Energy Radio.
I do.
And how long have you been doing that?
We are in our 6th year of broadcasting.
Okay. And how much on this new book? How much did some of these guests influence the material in this book?
Not a whole lot.
Really? Okay.
Not really a whole lot. One of the things when we wrote this book, one of the things that we decided early on was we weren't really going to rely on very much contemporary information. We found that, this just sounds awful, that people were putting too much of their own opinion in and stating things as fact. And when we started researching what was being stated as fact, we found out that either it was based on an erroneous piece of information, or that there really wasn't anything to back up what they were saying. So in this, so in this book, because it really goes into mythology, and we wouldn't put anything in there unless we could find a parallel claim, a parallel story, a parallel concept coming from a different culture. And when I say different culture, I don't mean there was something in Egypt and we also found it in Sumerian literature.
Right.
Too close. But if we found it in Sumerian literature and maybe China, because they have a very different concept, that would maybe be okay. If we found it in the Americas or Australia, I mean, that was ideal. And that was really what we looked for these parallels or commentary coming from sources that were not in the same area, because you can't claim, trade routes. You can't, it just is very different. One of the things that was very interesting is that we found that a lot of the literature that was coming out prior to 1940 was actually very clearly stated, and the issues that we're having today were the same issues that they were having. A lot of books were from the turn of the century, 100 years ago. We don't know who built the pyramids.
Right.
and the things that they were saying were very similar to what is still being said today.
Okay. And someone might look at this and say you just picked and choose certain ones to make your point, but there's a lot of stuff that is different in these mythologies. How would you respond to that?
To put it in the book, we had to kind of pick the best examples. But the number of things that we left out, I have a huge box of papers sitting on the floor still, of stuff we didn't include. We wanted to make the book be readable, and, we wanted to make our point, but we didn't want to be overly redundant in presenting, these people say this, and 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 they're all basically saying the exact same thing.
Right. Okay. Well, actually, the book is very readable. It's a very pleasant read. And you get a lot of information in there, which is it's a good combination. One of the things I noticed, you didn't use any kind of footnotes or anything. Why did you decide to go away from that?
Because I'm the one that wrote it.
Not a fan of footnotes?
No.
No, neither am I most of the time, but there were a couple things in there I wish I had footnotes for that I was curious about.
And I have a new book kind of lurking in the background. I mean, I'm starting my research on it, and I have kind of a list of things that I want to talk about. And I think I might footnote it. I don't know. It's kind of a pain in the butt.
I'm
that's
sure.
Basically the thing is, it's a pain in the butt. And, I'm not OC enough.
I know Graham Hancock said when he did Underworld, it was a nightmare because he had to footnote everything to try and offset the critics. And he said it was just a horrible experience.
Yeah, I believe it.
But
I totally believe it.
There was like a part in your book where you're talking about Enlil being replaced with Marduk. And I was kind of wondering where that had come from. And that was like, I think, one of the main points where I was like, I wish there was a footnote right there so I could see where she got that information.
Oh, I know where you're talking about. I don't know. I would have to dig through my box.
Oh, I'm sure. But, yeah, overall, I'm generally not a fan of footnotes. Most of the time you look at a footnote and it just relates to the footnote before it. And you're like, oh, glad I looked that up.
Ibid.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So, now, one of the things you do here is you break this this whole. Do you want to give people an overview of this, of the theory here that you've put forth?
Sure. And I'm going to kind of start a little bit backwards and tell you how we got into this whole process because
Okay.
I think it will make more sense.
All right, that's fine.
During the whole 2012 thing, I mean, this was about 3 years before 2012 actually happened, and there were a lot of TV shows or TV stations putting on shows about 2012. And one of the things that they would talk about, they would say, well, the Mayas say this, and there are 5 cycles, and the Egyptians and the Indians, they say the same thing, period. And they would end the sentence. And it bugged me. And so I started to do some digging into some of these other areas to see what they had to say. And I started reading some Vedic texts, which were fascinating, boring as hell, but fascinating at the same time. And one of the things that they had in there as part of their narrative was the story of Manu and the fish. And in reading that story, it read a lot like Noah's Ark.
Right.
Like remarkably a lot like Noah's Ark. Which got me thinking, because India to me was separate enough that it just kind of seemed odd. And my feeling is that there is some purity that comes out of India that hasn't really been totally corrupted, and especially out of some of those early texts. Anyway, so that was my feeling. Well, one of the things that I had heard years ago that there were at least 250 different flood stories around the world. Other authors have put out much higher numbers, 500, 600 flood stories around the world. In hearing that statement, my belief was, we went into this book with a lot of beliefs, and what we ended up with was not what we believed. But anyway, one of my beliefs was the Nile River overflowed, and they wrote down their flood story. So they have a flood story.
Right.
Something happens over here, and they write down their flood story, and they have a flood story. And so,
That's also kind of the mainstream view of the flood explanation.
Right, until you start looking at their mythology. Because you start looking at the mythology of these flood stories, and you can really be inclusive in one paragraph. And the paragraph reads like this. There was a righteous, pious, or virtuous man, kind of depending on the culture, you pick the adverb you want, who is warned of a flood. He builds a boat, an ark, digs a canoe, climbs a tree, or climbs to the top of the mountain. He survives the flood with his wife, maybe his sister, there might be an old man, this small group of people, there might be a couple of children. In some of the stories, there are animals that are saved. Not all of them, but some, or at least it's not in the narrative. And in a few of the stories, it describes an animal being released, not always a bird, but an animal. Some of them are birds. And, they repopulate the earth. And that was it. I mean, I thought I would find hundreds of variations to this story, but we didn't. That was it. So they tell the same story, like, as an example, in South America, these two brothers are warned by a llama that a flood is going to happen.
Which is just kind of amusing to me, honestly.
Well, it is kind of amusing, but, when you read the story, it's like they're warned by a llama that a flood is going to happen, and they're told to go climb to the top of the mountain. So they take some animals to the top of the mountain and their wife, and the waters are coming up, and the mountain rises so that they never are under the water. And then when the water recedes, the mountain goes back down, and they all live happily ever after. Mm-hmm. And so on the surface, really on the surface, it sounds different. But when you look at some of the key elements, it really is the same.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And so once we saw that, and I was like, oh, my God, this is so cool. We realized that we were too far into this early narrative, and so we needed to go back to in the beginning. And so we took these different mythological stories and kind of made a giant Excel spreadsheet and started plugging in where these stories fit in the timeline. Because one of the things we found is this culture would leave out this little detail, and this culture would include this detail. So with the Noah story, for example, there are some that talk about an animal being released to check for the water. And it's not like it's in the Middle East that you find the animal being released. It's like there's a Native American culture that talks about an animal being released, and, and a South American culture that talks about an animal being released. So it wasn't even geographically isolated. And so we felt like, one of the beliefs that we went into was that they kept what they remembered. They kept the parts that were important. And so by looking at enough of them, you could start finding pieces that the Greeks maybe overlooked or deleted, or it got edited out because it made them sound bad, And that is what we did, was start putting these pieces together and creating this narrative, creating a timeline, starting with the creation, for lack of a better word, and bringing it forward. Where we end the book is with the rise of civilization, and really with our ability to document our own history and writing.
Right, which is about 6,000 years ago.
Correct.
Okay, but the basic overview is also that these gods that are talked about in all these myths were not gods like we think of a paranormal, supernatural sort of being, but actual mortal beings in some way.
Correct. And the conclusion in the book, we just present the material. So I want to be clear with your listeners. We present the material. We throw out some questions, like, well, could it be this? But we don't express this is what it is, because we want you to draw your conclusion. But to talk about the book on air, I need to, put out my opinion. So this is my opinion. Some people, I don't want them to believe that this is what I'm putting there, and this is what's in the book. But we came to the conclusion, and when I say we, my co-author, Wayne La Liberty, who's my husband, came to the conclusion that the only way this book would make sense without going into a bunch of really weird iterations and trying to make a square peg fit into a round hole is if we shared the narrative and talked about these gods as extraterrestrials, because all of the stories make sense. It's not some of the stories make sense. All of the stories make sense. And then you're not sitting there going, well, but this is a representation for this, and it goes into this much deeper level, because I think that's what we did to rationalize it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so what do you think these beings were? Like, your personal opinion.
Not from here. Or let's put it this way. This is what we feel very strong about. It was that at one point in time, a group of 8 beings came from somewhere. The Dogons say from Sirius. They're the only ones that make a definitive claim to anywhere, where they talk about the Nomo, 8 Nomo coming in this ark. Other planetary constellations that are referenced fairly regularly are the Pleiades, Orion, and the Big Dipper, the North Star.
Right.
But there were these 8 beings. And so when you read the mythology, they talk about this group, this progenitor group, either creating a race or that they were their children. And so whether, it gets kind of complicated because when you listen or read the descriptions of what these beings look like, not the progenitors, because those are very clear. They look like a half man, half fish, half man, half snake. There's some reptilian aquatic thing going on with them. So that's very clear. But when you start getting into these successive generations, it's unclear whether, one, they created them through some kind of genetic engineering. 2, they, or if they were some other race that came to the earth that we were now interacting with. Because whenever there is a change of leadership, there's always a war associated with it. So whether it was a group uprising, that were children, genetically engineered, slave people, or whether it was a separate group, some other star system that came and there was a war and they took over, we really don't know. There's not the smoking gun narrative, so that really is kind of speculative.
What do you think of Zecharia Sitchin's work in relation to that?
Which part?
Well, as far as where they came from and the genetic modifications and just his general story.
I mean, I think in general, it's okay. He really looks at Sumerian and Egyptian sources. There are things that he talks about. One of my biggest issues with him is the whole storyline having to do with the gold. Looking at mythology, there's really not clarity that they came here looking for gold. I mean, they talk about gold to a certain extent in mythology, but there's not. And even in his work, okay, all right, here's my story, and I'm sticking with it. So I just kind of figured he knew what he was talking about. They were here for the gold. So I started digging around looking for the gold. Couldn't find the gold. And, I said earlier, we weren't really relying on contemporary material.
Right.
Well, I couldn't find it. So I'm picking up his books going, okay, because he's pretty good about footnoting and putting in, quotes from texts and whatever. So I'm like, all right, there's got to be something. And then I can go and research that to get my verification because I couldn't find the verification. Well, when I finally found the part where he talks about the gold, it is based on one word and the symbol. And the word was Zuaz, and the symbol, the Sumerian symbol for that, or word for that, kind of looked like a drill. And based on that, that's where he came up with, they came here looking for the gold.
Interesting. It seems like he did that with a few things, where he took one thing and then just kind of ran with it.
Yeah, and so, and I'll tell you, I spent a month, literally a month, 10 to 12 hours a day looking for the gold. Never found it.
All right. Actually, I want to talk to you a little more about gold, but I got to play this disclaimer. We'll be back in 45 seconds.
Okay.
The opinions expressed by the host and guests on Where Did the Road Go are their own and do not represent those of WVBR or its management. Join us on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com, where you can send us questions for our live guests via email or the live chat room. You can also check out our upcoming schedule, blog, links section, book reviews, videos, and links to our Twitter, Facebook, iTunes, and much more. That's wheredidtheroadgo.com.
And tonight on Where Did the Road Go, we are talking to Dr. Rita Louise. And she has a new book called Man-Made, The Chronicles of Our Extraterrestrial Gods. And we were just talking about gold. And one of the chapters you have in here is actually about gold. And it's something that I have always wondered about, that gold seems so important to our ancestors. And you kind of go into that a little bit in this book about why and like how many cultures revere gold.
Well, one of the things that you find in mythology is some references to gold and immortality, but they're very vague.
But it's also kind of a cross-cultural thing where all cultures seem to all ancient cultures, human cultures, seem to have this thing for gold. And why?
Exactly.
And why gold?
Well, because gold was important to the gods. I mean, that does seem clear just from the words that are used to talk about gold. And I think, when I look at our culture, I think that a lot of the things that we believe in and a lot of the things that we hold valuable were things that the gods held valuable. Like in the Americas, in South America, if I'm correct with this, the gold didn't belong to the people. The gold belonged to the gods. And so, there was definitely an ownership with them, and it had status and power associated with it. One of the things, we were talking about Zachariah Sitchin, he was talking about, talks about using the gold to protect themselves from, protect their environment or, sending it back to Nibiru to seed the atmosphere or whatever he talks about.
Right.
And, but what was interesting, there was one myth that came out of South America, which talks about El Dorado. Okay, let me actually back that up. In Mesoamerica, one of the words for gold actually translates as excrement of the gods, which kind of got me thinking, excrement? But then I thought, a lot of this was like, okay, well, here's this here, but how does that relate to other things? Okay, so they're talking about excrement of the gods. Then we have the group called the Shining Ones, who are talked about as being shiny and gold-like in appearance. And I was like, that's pretty interesting. And actually, it's that synchronistic thing. So I'm working on this gold chapter, and Ancient Aliens ran their episode on the gold. And or something like, I think they were talking about gold. And one of the things that they talked about in there was the story of El Dorado, which I did research, and it is really a real story that came out of an old book, because I only really liked using those 1800, early 1900 books because they're not making it up. They're just reporting it. And but I found other corroboration, not just from one book. And what they talked about was that El Dorado was actually a person. It wasn't a city. El Dorado was the chief of these people. And once a year, they would take gold and make it into a powder, and then they would cover the body with some kind of a resin or oil or something, and then spray this powdered gold onto El Dorado, thus making him look like a god. And he would go and do a bunch of ceremonies, and and this was in Lake Titicaca, and when the ceremonies were done, he would jump into the water and wash the gold off, and the festivities would begin. So I thought that was just really interesting, but then my thoughts traveled even further than that. If you think about, like in Egypt, for example, we have the death mask. How can anyone forget the death mask of Tutankhamun? I mean, it's that solid gold mask. And in Egyptian culture, and it's not just Egyptian culture, it's in other cultures around the world, the death mask, mostly gold. Some of them are green jade, which is kind of interesting, but mostly gold, made the person look more godlike so that they would be accepted into the afterworld as a god and obtain immortality. But why would you have to cover your face with gold to make you look more godlike unless the gods looked gold colored?
Well, it's definitely interesting, and it's not something I had come across before. You also mentioned the Ark of the Covenant being made of gold. And obviously, we have uses for gold in our high-tech world. And it could very well be that the Ark of the Covenant was a piece of technology as well, utilizing that gold.
Oh, I definitely think that the Ark of the Covenant was a piece of technology. And one of the things that I talk about in the book is that I believe that these extraterrestrials were covering their body with gold because they had some kind of an issue with the UV radiation. I mean, what is one of the high-tech things we use gold for? They use gold sheets on space, like on the space shuttle or on this different space things to protect it from UV radiation. Mm-hmm. And tied to that, and this we found even more around the world, was people actually using ochre. I kind of likened it to the poor man's gold.
Right.
Because one, they use it for sun protection. But when you go back to some of the very early burials, they covered the bodies with ochre. And it's a sign of beauty. And in rituals still found in indigenous cultures, they will cover themselves with ochre for ceremonial purposes. So I think there was, we don't claim we answered all the questions in the universe, but I really feel like we're on to something with this whole idea of them using these things to cover the body to protect themselves from the sun.
And maybe when Sitchin translated that thing about them needing it for their atmosphere, maybe it really meant they needed it to protect them from our atmosphere.
And, I thought about that, but I didn't want to go, well, he was wrong. That's just bad.
Yeah, well, there's a whole website out there called Sitchin is Wrong.
Yeah.
And I don't, and very rarely, I don't think ever you can say someone is 100% correct anyway. So any theory is going to have its correct and incorrect things. It's just a matter of levels.
Well, for the most part, I don't have an issue with his work. I think, he brought a lot of material forward that was not being looked at.
Oh, sure.
Some of the conclusions he made, maybe not.
Right.
To me, the biggest thing was his Lost Book of Enki. Because, and it wasn't that he wrote the book, because I enjoyed that book a lot. What I have seen happen is that people have read that book and think it's one of his factual books. But when you read the introduction to the book, and it's either in the last paragraph, this is inscribed in my mind, or the last sentence of the second to last paragraph, but it's in the very end of the introduction where he makes the statement that says he's taking the narratives that he's found and then kind of made this account of their history using the voice, that the Sumerians would use. And so that's why there's that kind of rhythmic flow and it looks very authentic, right? Because he used their prose, the way they would write the narrative. But people think that book is a piece of fact, and it's not.
And he's very clear about that, too. He's not trying to deceive anyone.
It's a little bit hidden. It is a little bit hidden.
I do believe it is listed as fiction, though.
But there are a lot of people that think it's fact.
Yeah.
And then they base their work on it. And so it's kind of like a myth perpetuating people trying to do scientific research, which...
Yeah.
It's bad.
Well, one of the things you do in the book is you break things down to cycles of time.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was an interesting way to do it, showing the different... And you mainly go with the 5-world idea, that we're in the 5th world, and you break it down to what was the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th worlds before this. And one of the things I found interesting is you actually date the flood to about 34,000 years ago rather than the end of the last ice age. Can you explain why a little bit?
Well, it actually said in the book was that we found 3 blips on the radar, because no one has found any solid evidence to date the flood, in my opinion. However, with that said, from a mythological perspective, there are all right, in Egypt, China, and very much in Samaria, they all date the flood to about 30,000, between 25 and 30,000 years ago.
And that was partially with the king's lists and stuff like that.
It was the Sumerian king's list, but also the king's list that comes out of Egypt. And it's also talking about the rulership in China, because Fuxi and Nuwa were supposedly the first rulers after the flood, but they ruled like 25,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting about that date, too, is it kind of matches up with Robert Bauval's Age of the Sphinx. When he thinks the Sphinx was built, would have been around the time of that flood or maybe shortly after it.
Interesting. I did not know that.
Yeah. He dates the alignment and the Age of the Sphinx to about 30,000 years ago.
But see, one of the other things that's interesting is that, I don't know if you've had Sam Osmanagash, the Bosnian pyramid guy, on your show.
Nope.
One of the things he talks about is they found, I think it was a leaf, buried. So there's the surface of the pyramid, the external surface of the pyramid, and in their digging, they actually found a viable leaf right on the surface of the monument. Okay, so it was buried under, like 2 feet or 3 feet worth of dirt, which they were able to carbon-14 date. And the dating came up at about 24,000 BC, which supports, in my opinion, that 25 to 30,000 BC date as well.
How so?
Well, if there was dirt starting to form on the top of the pyramid, just natural sedimentation because it's not being used anymore, and that's thus starting the burial process, it means that pyramid wasn't being used after that date.
Right, okay. I thought, for some reason, I thought he dated that to about 10,000 years old.
That was prior to them finding the leaf, which was, it was this year. It was fairly recent. That was a fairly recent find.
Now, when you look at like Plato and the Bible, it seems like the flood is more recent. So it seems like maybe there was a few different floods, maybe one around 30,000, 34,000 years ago, and another one at the end of the Ice Age.
And it's possible, but even with that, there's not really the archaeological, not for a global flood.
Well, the most recent Ice Age stuff seems to be that, and actually the guest I have on next week is one of the people who is going to be talking about this, how the ice caps actually melted in such a short time that science can't explain what could have melted them so quickly. And that would have caused all kinds of havoc worldwide.
Well, there are, some people that talk about, an impact in the Carolina Bays around 11,000, 12,000, we'll just say 12,000 BC, that could have created a huge melt. That's why we said that there were blips, because in that dating, in that, end of the Ice Age dating, there's a number of weird and anomalous things that happen, which include the megafauna, the woolly mammoths that get frozen in ice.
Yeah, instantly,
so there was a melting and then a freezing that happened, boom, and water for them to get buried in. And so that's why, we said, okay, this is where the bleeps are. Because what was interesting was once you hit that 30,000 years, one, no more Neanderthals, boom, they're gone. And so they were eradicated. But there is a huge shift in culture that happens at that point in time. We invent the boat, or there's an infusion of information that happens. We start baking bread. We start, in art, they start seeing things like cloth on some of like the Venus sculptures. It looks like they actually are wearing some kind of clothing. We have the bow and arrow gets invented. And so there are these cultural things that start happening in that period of time. which are just really strange. But if it was kind of an annihilation event that was happening, well, then maybe they wanted to kickstart this new group. But we also find the same thing happening right in that 11,000, actually it's about 9,000 BC, where we find this next round of information download that's happening. The beginning of agriculture, domestication happens at that point in time. The beginning of bigger cities, like Jericho and well, I'm going to say Göbekli Tempe. That still is kind of an enigma out there, which
and
I can't
and a little bit
explain.
older than everything else. Well, considerably older than everything else, I guess.
Well, but Jericho, for example, their first settlements were about 7,000 BC. And they're I can never say the name of this place, Çekilhoyal.
Yeah, in Turkey.
In Turkey, I mean, that's dated to about 8,500 BC. So there are things that they're starting to develop more city life. There's one of my favorites. Okay, people go, well, how do you know that there was this, alien intervention that was going on? And these are a couple of my favorite examples of miracles. I mean, you just can't express it in any other way. Either there was an intervention that happened, or it was just a miracle. So, for example, this one is my favorite. So, about 9,000 BC, a form of grain mixed with goat grass. Okay, so that's like saying you took an apple tree and a cherry tree and you kind of held them next to each other and they produced cherry apple plants with viable offspring. I mean, it doesn't happen in nature. Well, I mean, unless you're Monsanto, but I don't think they existed back then. And so, but the result of this crossbreeding of two separate species, cat, dog, don't happen, was a wheat that had more gluten, and so it made better bread. So then again, around 3,500 BC, this upgraded wheat had another miracle. It did. And it mixed with a different kind of grain and produced a wheat, which is the kind of wheat we actually still eat today. I mean, there's been some advancements that have happened over time, but it was just like, boom, here's this new kind of wheat. But it was two species. It wasn't, we picked the good wheat over here, and these have big kernels, so these are the ones we're going to plant, and we get a better wheat. This was two species happening. One of the other things that we find during that period, which is just bizarre, is, I mean, there's the domestication of plants, which, whatever, that one doesn't bother me. But it's about the animals, the domestication of animals, because between around 8,500 BC to about 2,500 BC, every animal that has been domesticated on this planet was domesticated, period. So in the next 5,000 years that we've had from the last domesticated animal, we have not managed to domesticate one, even though we're smarter, but we haven't managed to do it. And one of the other ones that was just kind of one of those mind blowers was pack animals. And so I'm like putting my thinking cap on. In the Middle East, I can't remember the other place, and in South America, the horse, the horse, the camel, and the llama, okay, which would be the South American pack animal of labor, all were domesticated within a 1,500-year period of each other, based on archaeological records. And that's it. 1,500 years. Why did they all decide they needed cars, in that little period of time?
Interesting.
And, and again, you start talking about, okay, the idea of domestication, and these guys decide to domesticate a horse. Okay, well, these guys got camels, so, okay, they maybe want to domesticate it, but why South America? And why in that same window of time?
Yeah.
I mean, like,
Yeah.
like the first plants that were domesticated in South America in the Peru area, which I think is very interesting, considering, the megalithic structures, the elongated heads, I mean, everything they got going on in Peru. They started domesticating plants about 8,000 BC. 8,000 BC, which was really not a whole lot after wheat was beginning to be domesticated in the Fertile Crescent. And in China, it's about the same. It was a little bit after, but not by a whole lot. And we're talking about in a vastly different geographic area.
Well, I also found it interesting that you comment on how man himself shows signs of domestication.
Well, we are a very domesticated species.
But you have an actual list there of what generally defines domestication. You show how much man fits into that list.
Right. And but there are actually, there are characteristics of being domesticated as far as what goes on. One of the things that I thought was really interesting was them talking about some physical changes that happened based on domestication. So one of the things that they have seen in, I'm going to say wolves, when they, breed them in captivity and then they take the most docile of those, their faces change, their muzzle starts to shorten. Their bodies start to look more adolescent in nature, like not as muscular, not as full grown or strongly grown. And if you go and think about Australopithecus, the difference between us and our early ancestors, our faces did flatten, like our muzzle did go in. Our facial features softened. Our teeth got smaller. We got smaller. I mean, we got taller, but
not as muscular.
There's a lot of things, we were talking about the domestication, but there are also a number of genetic changes that happened to mankind in just this very short period of time. But I'll just throw out one example, and there is something called the FOX2 gene, which is found in just about every form of life on the planet. And it is responsible for communication. And this gene had not changed for like 7 million years. 7 million years. But in the time of I'm going to say Homo habilis, Homo erectus, it went through a number of changes so that mankind and Neanderthal were able to communicate like verbally in the way that we do. In like a 2 million year period. It went through all of these changes, and there are these changes that happened. That was just one example in a very short period of time that don't make sense. Like us losing our hair. People will say, oh, well, maybe it was a mutant, and they had this like genetic thing going on where they didn't have a lot of hair, or their brains were bigger, they had a bigger cranium, and that spread out into the population. But if you think about it, if you are a haired species in the general sense of the word with a certain level of consciousness, why would you want to marry some hairless weirdo freak ape thing with a big head and no hair? You know what I mean? You would think that those creatures would be more outcasts than become the genetic norm.
All right. Well, we're starting to run a little bit low on time. I wanted to just briefly cover your other books and your radio show. Actually, the title, I liked one of your old books, Avoiding the Cosmic 2x4.
I guess you get it. There are so many people that don't get that title.
Well, what want to explain just briefly what the book is?
And so that book talks about health and healing, kind of that mind-body connection that we were talking about, where it says that if you experience physical disease, it's like the universe giving you the perpetual smack up the side of the head, the cosmic 2x4. And it's really wanting for you to stop and look and listen to see what messages you're receiving, because if you act on those messages, you can start to restore health in your life. Or act on them before you get sick, and then you won't get sick, which would be the avoiding the cosmic 2x4 part.
Nice. And the Power Within, kind of on the same sort of health issues?
Power Within is really kind of the hands-on book. It really is a book about energy medicine. So how you can work with your energy, or if you're interested in being an energy healer or something like that. It's very technique-driven, very exercise-driven. And so it's really the hands-on practical guide to working with your energy and restoring health in your body.
Nice. Okay, the other one is Dark Angels, an insider's guide to ghosts, spirits, and attached entities. Have you dealt a lot with ghosts and stuff?
I worked with a paranormal group for about 5 years. Also have worked with a house healing team for a couple of years. And in my private practice, I've done quite a bit of entity release work with people coming into my office. And so this book kind of talks about ghost hunting, about entity release, their motives. It's a fun book. I mean, it's an informative book, but it's a fun book because I tell a lot of stories and they're really written from my voice. And so it's a fun book. I mean, it's a good book. It's an informative book, but it's not a spooky book because I'm kind of scared of the dark. And that kind of comes through in the narratives. It's like, well, I got to get out of here. No.
All right. And your radio show, Just Energy Radio, now, you do that live, right?
Correct. It airs live every Thursday evening from 8 to 10 p.m. Central Standard Time. And they can get more information about that at www.justenergyradio.com. We have over 6 years worth of archives with that. We YouTube our show, so you can go to YouTube. You can like us on Facebook. My primary webpage, however, this would be good to put out, is www.soulhealer.com. That's SOULHEALER.com, soulhealer.com. And that's kind of a portal to everything Rita Louise. So my books, the radio show, my training program, everything.
Nice. Okay. And actually, I really like the way you set up your show archive, because you have all the previous shows each guest has been on as well linked right there, and that's really handy.
Thank you.
So, yeah, and I've been listening to your show for probably about 2 years now.
I just am so tickled that you do.
It's one of the few I actually check on a somewhat regular basis. I usually just listen to archives. I don't tend to listen to a lot of stuff live, but I'll go through and go, ooh, I'm interested in that one and that one and that one. So, all right. Well, thank you so much for the interview. And I will have a book review actually up on our site, wheredidtheroadgo.com, sometime soon.
Well, if you could send me a link to that, I will link from my book thing back.
Certainly.
Get this little thing going on.
All right. And next week we have Randall Carlson, and we'll be talking about cycles of time and cycles of cataclysm and sacred geometry. And it should be a very interesting show as well, as was this one. And I thank you very much, Rita.
Thanks for having me. Great interview.
And as always, to end stuff off, here's some Psyche Corporation. We'll see you next week. WhereDidTheRoadGo.com.
Come in, do you read me? Do you understand the numbers pouring over your connection? To perfection, 5, 8, 13. Have you heard the singing soaking into our transmission? 21, 34, 55, 89, 144. Whence came this dream that fogs my mind? Behind a curtain, outside of time. Can you hear the knowledge plays the whirring of the world? Can you hear the knowledge plays the whirring of the world? Can you edge of the universe. Ventricles and Tatriarch, chambers numbered 1597. And counting. And counting. Can you